Hello plant lovers, it is Matthew in Melbourne welcoming you back to my channel. Thank you very much for finding me. If you're new here, I grow cold, cool, intermediate orchids here in Melbourne, Australia, without a greenhouse, without any humidifiers or grow lights, just me and my amateur skills indoors or outdoors or not at all. So if that sounds like your growing conditions, do hit subscribe. I post every week. As I said, complete amateur. Take everything I say with the grain of salt. And today, plant lovers, perhaps you can see the fabulous foliage of, ta-da, some jewel orchids. So yes, this video is about my jewel orchids and their basic care and a repot because I just bought this little seedling. Look at that leaf and look at that little plastic pot. It needs a repot. So we're going to do basic care and a repot. 2 for 1. Goodness me. But first, a little context, shall we? Jewel orchids. Now, they have become very, very, very fashionable and to some degree quite expensive. And I must say, not something I was particularly interested in. That whole sort of expensive indoor tropical plant thing is kind of just not my bag. I don't do tropical things because I don't have a greenhouse and I don't have humidifiers and grow lights. So a lot of tropical plants are just a bit too tricky for me. And I kind of lumped the jewel orchid in that same basket. Well, I could well have been a little judgmental because it turns out they're incredibly easy to look after and the foliage is, surprise, surprise, amazing. But actually, look at that flower. That, I think, is a pretty striking flower. And I'm quite happy with the flowers of jewel orchids as well. So there you go, you get 2 things for 1. Fabulous foliage all year and very easy to bloom with quite striking flowers. So, putting aside my initial hesitance, I bought this one as a little seedling and it was about this size when I bought it, thinking, oh well, nothing ventured, nothing gained, and I seem to remember it was comparatively inexpensive. And then not really knowing anything about it and not particularly caring, I just potted it on and left it to its own devices. And look, kind of gone gangbusters and sort of encouraged me to get others because the foliage is amazing and they are very easy to look after and they're very happy in slightly tricky conditions. So, but we'll get to that. Let us wind back and talk about jewel orchids in their natural habitat. So there are 3 types of plants that are called jewel orchids. They are Ludisia discolor, which is this one, and then there is this one, which is Macodes, petola, and the third one, which I do not have, Anoectochilus, which actually also is native to Australia. So there you go. I'm going to have to find that one. So Anoectochilus is sort of Australian, more Southeast Pacific. Ludisia discolor is sort of more Himalayan, China, Laos, Thailand sort of part of the world. And Macodes is more sort of Southeast Asia, so that's Philippines, Borneo, and even up to the southern Japanese islands, which is quite amazing. So quite distinct geographies, I guess, although the leaves all look relatively similar. They're all velvety with amazing striations. So that's where they're from. But they all essentially grow in pretty much the same way, which is they're terrestrial and they creep along the forest floor. So as you can see from this one, Ludisia discolor, and I'll come in and show you, but you can kind of see that these stems emerge and then it sort of creeps and lolls along the ground. And I would imagine that it will also possibly root from some of the nodes that are touching the ground, which is one of the ways it might spread itself, a bit like layering a plant. I have yet to find out because mine isn't lolling enough just yet. So forest floor, creeper, loller, and as you can see by the foliage, which is of course the thing that everyone grows these plants for, is their incredible foliage. Now, given their darker coloring and their sort of reddish undertones, you can see that it is an understory plant and it is creeping along the forest floor, not in direct sunlight. So first rule of thumb is these plants, imagine they're growing in the bottom of the forest floor, lots and lots of dappled light, not deep shade, but dappled light. The other general rule of thumb is, because they don't have pseudobulbs and they come from fairly moist forests, is that this is not an orchid that has a dry rest season, nor is it one that you want to allow to dry out. Doesn't mean you want to keep it wringing wet, but it's just something that you need to keep moist but not wet. And in fact, when it comes to watering, which we'll get to, I just treat these like regular houseplants. But before we go any further, a quick literary segue. Look at this beautiful book. It is called John Reeves, Pioneering Collector of Chinese Plants and Botanical Art. Now, this guy was in what was then known as Canton in the early 19th century. And he was a tea merchant, essentially. But he had a side hustle for various botanists in that he would collect specimens and create watercolours of them and send both the botanic illustrations and plant specimens back to Britain, largely, where collectors would pay huge amounts of money for the boxes that he would send of seeds, bulbs, cuttings and plants, many of which survived. And he devised ingenious ways of being able to ship live plants back to Britain across different sort of climatic zones. So amazing. Imagine in the 1820s shipping plants across the world and they survived. It's quite amazing. But I was flicking through this book and what should I find but this beautiful illustration of Ludisia discolor. So in fact, he was the one that first recorded it. And this illustration was made actually in Macau, probably in around 1820, 1830. And the plant then was called Goodyeara discolor. Obviously, there was probably a Mr. Goodyear, I would imagine, who had sponsored the expedition. Anyway, this plant was growing in the garden of a man called Thomas Beale, and it was he who provided the specimen for John Reeves and his team of botanic artists to paint. So there you go. If you are interested, this is a fantastic book because it talks about many plants that were taken from China back to Britain and introduced into horticulture. Lots of chrysanthemums, magnolias, all manner of beautiful things. Anyway, there you go. Literary discourse number 1. Now then, let's get to basic care. Light, water, food, temperature. The things that all of us need to thrive. Again, as I pointed out, I was a little bit put off by them because I thought they'd be really finicky, tricky tropical plants because they do come essentially from the tropics. And as they are forest floor creepers, not particularly high altitude, so that's relatively warm, and they're all described as sort of intermediate to warm growers. Not something that I can really grow super well because our house can get quite cold in winter at night. Anyway, nothing ventured, nothing gained. It was a small, inexpensive plant, but look, it thrived. So first rule of thumb then, as we said, water. They are forest floor creepers. They don't grow in moist sort of stream side areas. They do grow in the sort of the regular forest floor. They're subject to usual rainfall. Now these are reasonably high rainfall areas and they don't particularly have a dry season. So you just got to keep your eye on it. Now, so saying, I'm not overly generous with the watering. I treat this like a house plant. Now, most other house plants I will let dry out quite a bit on the surface before I water them. A good rule of thumb is just the weight of the pot. Get a sense of how much the pot weighs when it's wet and how much it weighs when it's dry, and you can just lift it up and get a sense of whether it needs water or not. Otherwise, if you can get sort of a fingernail length down into the medium and it's dry, it's probably time to water it. But I would say if the top of the medium looks quite dry, give it a water. And quite a soaking water, and then let it dry reasonably before you then water it again. But don't keep it swimming, don't let it sit in water, and you'll be fine. I guess just relax about the watering. Okay, second point then, light. Now, they are, well, they're forest floor growers, so dappled light, as you can imagine, which isn't low light, but it certainly isn't direct sunlight. So you've got to try and find the happy medium. And where I have found the happy medium is that actually in replicating the forest environment. So if you've got taller plants, this sits quite beautifully under a plant that might have more arching leaves. So it's kind of going to get dappled light and sort of mimic what's going on in the forest. If not, somewhere where you've got reasonably protected indirect light that hopefully kind of moves somewhat as the sun moves around your house. I grow mine indoors all year because our winters are too cold outside. But if you were in somewhere tropical, of course, you could grow them outdoors all year, and in which case you could have very easily dappled conditions. But for me, they seem to thrive, as you can see, fine in an indoor environment. Now, what we might not be able to see, because it has actually recovered, is that I did give this one a bit too much light. So these are growing downstairs on the marble table at the bottom of the stairs. Now that gets, in summer, indirect bright filtered light, but in winter the sun is lower and there's more direct light penetration. And what I hadn't realized was where this was sitting, the light had got lower and was starting to hit the leaves, even though it was filtered through opaque glass. And the leaves just started to look less than happy. And I'll come in and show you and see if we can see. They just started to look lighter and mottled, and it was very obvious that it was light damage. So I moved it behind larger plants, gave it a bit more shade, and as you can see, all the new leaves are perfectly healthy. And in fact, the old ones seem to have perked up a bit too. So light is important, not deep shade, because it won't thrive as well, I don't think. But just be careful about any direct sun or even strong light, because it can actually damage the leaves. So try and replicate that dappled foresty floor environment if you can. Third point, fertilizer. Yes, this is something to fertilize all year. Ta-da! Now, I always put slow release fertilizer in the potting mix, and that's just a small number of the grains. They are heat activated, so they will ping and open their goodness from sort of spring onwards, well, as the temperature warms up. So you probably get 3 to 4 months juice out of a slow release fertilizer. I only do it once a year. But for the rest of the year, at maybe every third watering, I will give it something. Now, whether that's a tonic, which could be something that's seaweed based, or it could be worm milk, I've heard it now referred to, worm juice, the stuff you get from worm farms. So that isn't a fertilizer, it's a tonic. It's full of lots of wonderful biological things that the plant needs to thrive, but it's not a fertilizer. And I do also use fertilizers, and you can use any kind of liquid fertilizer that is for plants. Now, as this is a flowering plant, I would just use, and I do use, a pretty basic generic liquid fertilizer which has those NPK figures, and I made a video about fertilizing because you're wanting to promote all aspects of the plant's health, its roots, its leaves, and its flowers. So a general all-purpose fertilizer will do you pretty well. I would dial down the dilution though by at least a quarter or a sixth or even an eighth of what's recommended on the packet or the bottle. I always dial it right down, so it's just a splish of the fertilizer, because it's very easy to over fertilize things. And over fertilizing things, too much of those elements near the roots can actually cause damage. So be careful, dial it down a bit, and particularly as you're feeding this throughout the year, you don't want to overdo it. You can use an orchid specific feed, or you can just use a general feed. I don't think it really matters with this orchid. And fourth point, temperature. Now, as I said, I'm growing this indoors basically as a houseplant. So if you like the temperature, this is going to like the temperature. So not unlike many other orchids that you might grow indoors all the time. Phalaenopsis being exhibit number A. So yes, we have cooler nighttime temperatures in the house in winter because we don't have hugely powerful heating. So the temperature does drop, but it doesn't get freezing cold, obviously, because it's our house. And in summer, it can get quite warm because I'm in Melbourne, Australia. We can get quite hot summers. But where it is relatively cool downstairs. So basically, your household conditions, I think, if you're somewhere not tropical, are going to be fine. And if you're lucky enough to be in the tropics, you can grow it outdoors. And I guess allied to temperature is humidity. Obviously, these come from humid forests and forest floors, so there'll be much more humidity down there as it's all beginning to evaporate. But I don't go out of my way. I mist these as much as I mist all my other orchids, so maybe once a day as I go past in the morning with a cup of tea, talking to everything. So again, unless you're in a particularly dry environment because of perhaps you're heating, you don't need to really worry that much about it. Just mist it when you mist other things, and that could be once a day, once every second day. That's the treatment these get, and they are all looking fine. Okay, well, let's go through these one by one then. So this is Ludisia discolor. So this is, I think, incredibly easy to find just about everywhere in the world. Fabulous leafy striations. So as you can see, it is really a runner, which means when it comes to potting, you do need shallow tray kind of pots. And plant lovers, exhibit A little bonsai pot. Bonsai pots are in fact perfect for jewel orchids because they're shallow and they're wide and you get a huge variety of size and dimension. So I'm going to repot this one into here, but not just yet. So there we are, Ludisia discolor, and as you can see, the growth pattern is you have your main stem and you can grow these from cuttings, and then it sends up new growths like this one, and there is a tiny little new growth just coming up in there. And I feel, although I haven't had this long enough, nor is it resting on enough soil, I feel that as it creeps, the nodes that rest on the floor might well root. We'll have to see. Perhaps anyone who grows them and has got a big specimen can tell us. So that's Ludisia discolor. This is the other type. So this is Macodes, and it is a cross between Thailand and Sarawak. There we go. And as you can see, very, very, very beautiful leaves. Now I've had this one for 4 or 5 months, and this is a new growth, and it's got certainly one new growth point just coming out towards the bottom there. So yes, relatively healthy and not particularly slow growers. I mean, I think Paphiopedilums are much slower. So this is relatively vigorous, I think. Not something you've got to wait decades for it to do anything. Now this one is no ID, so I don't know what it is, but I give all three, should I have them, I would give them the same condition. So for me, it doesn't really matter what type this might be, but it's fabulous. Okay, well, why don't we go ahead and repot this one, and I'll show you what I pot them in. Okay, first thing we need is our seedling, as you can see. Next thing, our fabulous bonsai pot, and I even managed to find a little tray that it sits in. In an ideal world, we would have a beautiful ceramic dish, but we do not live in an ideal world, plant lovers. And I have got some crocks of old broken pot, which in fact is the pot from my Cymbidium rescue video. We have got regular terrestrial soil mix, and we have got perlite. Adding to that mix will be some slow release fertilizer and our magical product, which you can't see, the label is so tied, but mycorrhizal fungi. Okay, now here is our plant, little seedlinglet. Well, it's not a seedling, it is a rooted cutting by the looks of it. Fine little root system, there we are. Right, now on to our potting. So I have mixed together regular potting mix with perlite. So you want a loose, free draining mix, but not too loose. So I would think not dissimilar to many kind of regular potting mixes that you would use for a houseplant, and it's really going to depend what's going to work in your climate as well as to what the best mix will be. But this works for me and what I've used for them all. Let's just get rid of the old potting mix. Next step is let us just put some broken crocks of terracotta in here just to assist drainage. So let's put in our first layer like that. Then what we add, magic ingredients, a few grains of slow release fertilizer. Next magic ingredient, a slight dash of mycorrhizal fungi like that. Ta-da! And the mycorrhizal fungi helps promote strong root growth, and most orchids have very complex relationships with mycorrhizal fungi, particularly around seed germination. So there you go, we're helping the great cause. Now, as you can see, this plant has already got a bit of a lean and it's running that way. So I'm going to put it in the corner of this dish to give it as much chance of growing across before it needs to be repotted. So there we go, just gently putting that in and around, gently tapping that in. Doesn't need to be too compressed. There we are. Done. Now I'll just give it a good drenching. There we are, plant lovers, Jewel Orchid 101. And I guess the last thing to mention is that I think most of the flowers on all of those three types are essentially white and not dissimilar to this. And I was going to say not an ounce of fragrance, but oh, very, very, very faint, kind of lemony fragrance anyway. Quite lovely. Not unpleasant at all. So there you go. I hope that this has been of some use. I guess the moral of the story is Don't be put off by jewel orchids. I was, and now I'm not. They're relatively easy to grow. Treat them as any other houseplant. I think they're less fussy than your regular tropical indoor houseplant. Fabulous, fabulous array of leaves. There are many hybrids out there with different leaf colors. So you can develop a collection, and they sit very beautifully underneath other plants, so you can get a little bit of sort of forest floor canopy work going on in your house. Anyway, I am a convert and I'm really enjoying these, and I look forward to this one thriving and growing in its fabulous bonsai pot, and I probably will repot this one in a bigger bonsai pot next year. So thank you very much for watching. I do post every week, so hit subscribe if this has been of any use and you're interested in my next orchid adventure, which will be next Friday. So until then, plant lovers, take care wherever you are, and I look forward to seeing you next week.